morning, everyone. Welcome again, the big audience. As you all know, I'm going to be discussing the Passion this week. Interestingly, the Gospels spend as much time and they put as many words into discussing what happened to Jesus the last week of his life as they do the whole rest of his life. So the Gospel writers considered this week to be pretty important for the new Christian religion that was starting. This is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Palm Sunday, of course, the entry into Jerusalem, the disturbance at the temple, that was all supposed to happen on Palm Sunday. On Monday, Jesus wilts a fig tree, teaches in the temple. On Tuesday, he teaches in the temple some more. Wednesday, Jesus goes to the priest and accepts the bribe. On Maundy Thursday is what the Catholics call the Last Supper. And depending on which gospel you're reading, it was either a Passover Seder or it wasn't a Passover Seder. Good Friday is when he's arrested. He has the trial crucifixion and supposedly is put into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. On Saturday, apparently not much happens. Sunday, Easter, there's the empty tomb. So now I'll go through this in a little more detail. Before the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70, the Passover holiday was the most important public holiday that Jews celebrated. Now, it's not the most important holiday as far as holiness, but it was the most public holiday and involved large numbers of Jews coming from all over the Jewish settled world to Jerusalem to do prayers and to make sacrifices at the temple. Thousands of people came in. They doubled or tripled the population of Jerusalem for about a week and a half. The holiday itself is celebrated either for 7 or 8 days. Passover was a very politically charged holiday for Jews at that time. It celebrated the liberation of Jews from Egypt by God. And here the Romans were occupying Judea at this time, Judea and the Galilee. And the Jews were very much aware of the fact that to them they were enslaved all over again. Now, it wasn't quite the same as the enslavement in Egypt, but still they were under Roman occupation. Also, immediately adjacent to the temple was a Roman garrison. This is a map with north at the top. This is the temple area. The physical building of the temple is this little red thing. The whole rest of this is the Temple Mount, as improved and enlarged by Herod the Great. Now, this whole volume or whole area of land is something like between 36 and 37 acres. So this was a huge area. Okay, so what does Jesus do on Palm Sunday? According to the Gospels of Mark and Luke, Jesus rides a young donkey into Jerusalem, a foal. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus rides 2 animals at once into Jerusalem. Well, how did that happen? Well, this is a medieval picture of it. This shows the 2 different animals, an adult donkey and a foal. This is supposed to be fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Daughter of Zion, rejoice with all your heart about in triumph, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king is coming to you, his cause won, his victory gained, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Well, that's where Matthew got his 2 animals at once. What Matthew didn't realize was this is a typical Hebraic way of emphasizing something. I think they call it a doublet in Hebrew. Any Jew reading this would realize they're only talking about 1 animal here. But this was a way of emphasizing it by throwing in the and here, throwing in a conjunction. Matthew didn't read Hebrew, apparently. Matthew was reading the Greek translation, and he took it literally. Okay, so what happens next? Jesus is hungry, approaches a fig tree, wilts it, because it didn't have any figs. And he tells his disciples that their faith will give them power to do that and even to move mountains. My interpretation is that he was in a bad mood. Okay. So anyway, in the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus enters the temple grounds either Saturday or Monday for the first time. Now in John's Gospel, this stuff all occurred 3 years earlier. The Gospels, the two stories can't be harmonized. Most scholars, by the way, discount everything that's in John's Gospel as being written much later than the other three and representing church theology more than representing history. Okay, here's another picture of the temple and its grounds around it. This is looking toward the west. This is the eastern wall. This is the western wall. This is the Antonia fortress. Roman soldiers would have been garrisoned there during the time of the Passover, and they could they could look in these towers and see everything that was going on pretty much in the court of the temple. Now this is the outer court of the temple, what they called the court of the Gentiles. These were the inner courts. There was a court of women, and then there was an inner court where only the priests went. And inside this building, this is the temple itself, there was a small room in the back which Jews believed that God lived in. And they called it the Holy of Holies. By the way, Jews still think that to some degree because synagogues always have the sanctuaries facing toward Jerusalem so that they're facing what used to be the Holy of Holies. Now it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Okay, Jesus and the money changers, one of the better known stories in the Christian Bible. So what's going on here? The stories say that Jesus overturned the tables of money changers and pigeon sellers in the court of the Gentiles. Did he do that? We don't know what he did. But if he tried to stop all commerce, he couldn't do it very well because of the area that was involved. There was over 36 acres in the whole thing, and the outer court consisted of at least 25 acres. He couldn't possibly, all by himself, have stopped the pigeon sellers and the money changers. Okay, so why were there money changers there? What was that going on? Was that some kind of illegal, crooked stuff that Jesus was railing against? Well, it wasn't illegal and it wasn't crooked. Jewish law made it illegal to take coins with anybody's face on it into the temple to do contributions, money contributions. And the Roman coins all had the emperor's face on them, so they couldn't use those. The money changers were authorized to exchange the Roman coins that travelers came in with into Tyrian shekels, which were acceptable because they didn't have anybody's picture on them. The pigeon sellers were needed because to do sacrifices in the temple, you couldn't bring an animal with you that you had brought in from Cyprus or from Anatolia because it would have been all banged up. So they were selling unblemished animals, which is the only kind that was acceptable in the temple. And they were regulated. It's not like they were doing this on their own and making huge amounts of profit. Did they make money on it? Sure. I mean, they weren't doing it for free. Okay, so anyway, Jesus had been preaching this radical egalitarianism during his time in the Galilee. In other words, he tried to treat everybody as equal. People who were ritually unclean, people who had skin diseases, people who for one reason or another were considered unacceptable by main society. Jesus ate dinner with them. This is his radical egalitarianism. Apparently, his idea of overthrowing the money changers and pigeon sellers' tables was a symbolic act because he was unhappy that the temple, apparently he considered it to be a non-egalitarian institution. If he had done very much damage, he probably would have been arrested right then and there. I don't think the temple police would have let him get away with anything. So whatever he did was probably a minor disturbance, but he did something. So anyway, in the gospel stories, Jesus continues to teach, continued to criticize what was going on in the temple for another 3 days. And this is where he, at least the gospels have him saying a lot of his better known one-liners. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. That was one of them. And it was a good place to do it because the Roman soldiers were all over the place. So this is supposed to be Jesus' teaching. At the time, anything that caused any major disturbance would have been really frightening to the priests and especially to the Roman authorities. The Romans were always sensitive to any act that threatened their authority, and especially at a time that was politically charged like the Passover. So the Romans could have picked him up right there just for that. But they wouldn't have crucified him for that. Creating a disturbance like that was not a capital offense. We'll get to what was a capital offense in a minute here. There were always concerns about riots during Passover, and so the Romans would have had soldiers visible. Ordinarily, the Roman soldiers kept out of the way. They didn't want to aggravate people unnecessarily. But during Passover, they would have been out and they would have been visible. So anyway, it's conceivable that if Jesus really did have a large following and was preaching hostile things about the temple, there would have been concern about rebellion, or at least riots. Was there militancy in Jesus' movement? Jesus himself is not thought to have been militant. At least that's the way he's portrayed in the Gospels. But he had a large following, and it's conceivable that some of his closest followers not only were militant, but expected that soon there would be an apocalyptic end of the world as they knew it, and God's kingdom was going to be established. Now, how that was going to happen is not made clear, but there were Jewish expectations by some Jews, not everybody, that the Roman occupation was so bad and the political and economic situations were so bad at the time that God had to intervene in some way. Now, whether that would mean some direct force from heaven or would it mean an open rebellion on the ground, not clear. At least two of the disciples, because of their names, if nothing else, might have been interested in fomenting something. Who were the two? Simon Zelotes. His name implies that he was a zealot. Zealots were people who were more than eager to take up arms against the Romans. The other person, maybe, Judas Iscariot. His surname doesn't mean anything, but it might have been a mistransliteration of a Latin word, sicariot. The sicarii were assassins. They carried a dagger called a sicca, and notice how it's curved. With the flowing clothes that people had then, people didn't wear fitted clothes like we do. They could carry this thing under their cloak, come up next to somebody that they wanted to take out, and one quick movement of their arm would very quickly dispatch somebody, and they could move out of the way before anybody really knew what was happening. Maybe these people were eager enough to get rid of the Romans that they were willing to do something about it. Okay, the Last Supper. This is what the Catholic Church calls it. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, consider this to be a Passover Seder. Now, it would have been on Thursday evening because Jewish days begin at sundown. So this would have been the first day of Passover, and this would have been this would have been a Passover Seder. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John's Gospel, however, the Last Supper is the day before Passover. Why would he do that? Well, in John's Gospel, Jesus is crucified on the Passover day itself, on Friday. That would make Jesus an equivalent to the Passover sacrifice of a lamb. The day before Passover was the day of preparation. This is when women, of course, did all the food preparation, and they had to slaughter a lamb. Somebody had to slaughter a lamb because they ate a lamb, the Paschal lamb. This made Jesus the divine equivalent of the Paschal lamb. Early Christians used this Lamb of God Christology, God being the sacrificial Lamb of God. In Latin, I think it's Agnus Dei. Does that sound familiar to anyone from? Okay. Now, what else goes on at the Last Supper? According to Mark 14, as they were eating, he took bread, which might have been matzah, because it was the first day of Passover, and blessed and broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." Took the cup. After he took a drink out of it, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." It's unclear exactly what covenant he's talking about because the Christian covenant hadn't really been made yet. The Christian covenant was supposed to be something that happened really with the resurrection. But anyway, this is where the idea of the wine and the bread being converted to blood and body. Okay, truly I say to you, I shall not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it in the new kingdom of God. Most likely, this is according to modern historians, none of this happened. I mean, he had a Last Supper. Anybody who's old enough to eat would have a Last Supper. And you have a Last Supper. So most likely what he offered was an open meal to everybody, which he always did, this open commensality, a shared meal with everyone. The bread symbolizing his body, the wine symbolizing his blood, was probably an invention of the early Christians. And the idea was to have this religious meal, this commensal meal, as a commemoration of Jesus' death, or it could have been a commemoration of Jesus' continued presence. In other words, you would have the I'm trying to think of what the term would be now, the Eucharist type of meal, but it would be an actual meal. It wouldn't just be symbolic. And you drink the wine and have the bread and use that as a remembrance that the presence of Jesus was still among you. So it's thought that this was an invention of the early church. And if it wasn't an invention of the early church, who took notes? I mean, how would anybody know exactly what happened? We don't think any of the disciples were literate. So who was there taking notes? Who had a tape recorder? Okay, so what happens on Friday? According to the Gospels, he's arrested, he has a trial before the priest, and then he's crucified. Okay, so what happens here? This is, again, the Temple Mount. This is north. Garden of Gethsemane is down in here. It's up here, out here. So it wasn't that far of a walk, but we don't know where the house was. I mean, this is from the temple. And again, this is the Antonia fortress where the Roman soldiers were. This is the Garden of Gethsemane. They walk to the Garden of Gethsemane, and everyone falls asleep, it says in the Gospels, except Judas and Jesus. Again, who is there with the tape recorder? How do we know exactly what happened if everybody fell asleep? And why would everybody fall asleep after a meal? I mean, it must have been really good food. Or else, and I'm an anesthesiologist, these people might have been drugged. Could they do that then? Yes. They had herbal things, and I could think of 3 or 4 of them that could make people fall asleep and not remember much of anything for several hours. So it's at least possible, and this is conjecture, if you want absolute facts, you're not going to get it here today. It's possible that Judas drugged the other disciples, so they'd be asleep. Okay, and this is supposed to be where the betrayal occurs. So exactly what was being betrayed? Was it who Jesus was in the crowd? Most likely the Romans wouldn't need to have somebody point out who Jesus was. That wouldn't have been the thing that would have been betrayed. But whatever happened, he was apparently arrested by the temple police, not by the Roman authorities. And there would have been some rationale for this. They hear this is supposed to be the arrest. And it'd be easy to tell who Jesus was because he's the one with the corona. Okay, so was it plausible that the arrest was not done by the Roman authorities themselves? Yes. The Romans were not eager to cause a riot. And if they had Jesus arrested by the temple police, it would look like less of an infraction against the Roman authorities than if the Roman soldiers had actually done it. I think the Jewish people would have been very much aware and very much more concerned if the arrest had been by Roman soldiers. It would have been more likely to trigger a riot. But if it was the temple police doing it, they'd say, well, Jesus did something the temple police didn't like. So anyway, what happened next? The disciples woke up, apparently, and they all took off. So nobody knew what happened after that. Now, it's possible that the reason that Jesus was betrayed, the reason he was betrayed, was because Judas told the Romans that Jesus had been preaching not only that there was going to be a coming kingdom of God, but that Jesus himself would be the king on earth after this was established. The king would be a messianic king, not a secular king, but a king nonetheless. And this would also explain why there was a sign over Jesus' head on the cross. This probably actually is true. There probably was a sign over his head, apparently written in 3 languages. It was written in Aramaic, it was written in Greek, and written in Latin to make sure that everybody could read why they were crucifying him. That was what he was being convicted of basically of either sedition, what we would call sedition, or fomenting insurrection. Jesus was not crucified because he walked around saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the light. That isn't why the Romans wouldn't take him out for that. They didn't care what people did with their own religion. But they cared a whole lot if somebody was fomenting an insurrection. And they'd want to make sure that they could set an example. So, okay, the Jewish trial. According to the Gospels, he's brought before the priests, And there's a midnight trial of the Sanhedrin, which was essentially the deliberative body. It was like, well, I'm not sure if you could really call it. I'm trying to think of what else it would. It was, like a Senate or a House of Representatives or something. Anyway, it was a deliberative body that created laws for local enforcement. And then there's a denial by Peter, again, in the Gospels. Scholars think that none of this happened. The Sanhedrin didn't meet at night. And it's very unlikely they would have had anything like a midnight trial. But by putting that in the Gospels, nobody could disprove that it happened, because nobody would know. I mean, who would know that a trial didn't occur? The most likely thing is that as soon as the temple police arrested him, once they got him out of public view, the Roman soldiers would have taken custody of Jesus. Okay, according to the Gospels, he's taken before Pontius Pilate, who is the prefect of Judea. Okay, what do we know about Pilate? First of all, he's not an imaginary person. There was a real Pontius Pilate, who was the governor, effectively the governor of the prefect of Judea between the years 26 and 36. The closest you can pin down when Jesus was crucified was between these 2 years. People try to split the difference, and they try to pin it down to a month and a day. You can't do that. The information's just not there. He was crucified between 26 and 36. What we do know about Pontius Pilate from other sources was he was not a nice guy. He was interested in keeping the peace, and he was willing to use very harsh treatment, including beating people up and murdering them if he had to keep the peace. If a crowd would gather demanding reforms, he would send his thugs into the crowd and beat people up. Yes?
Why did the temple police give him to the Romans?
They did.
Why?
Because the Romans wanted him arrested.
Oh, okay.
The temple police might have wanted to take him out too because of the disturbance he made in the temple, but it was the Roman police who really wanted to get him out of the way.
So that was their way of getting him.
It was a way of doing it in an attempt, my surmising here, to minimize the possibility that his arrest would cause a riot. If Jesus was really as popular as he may have been, if he was arrested directly by the Roman police, it could have stirred up the crowd to a full-blown insurrection right then and there. The Romans didn't want that. But anyway, Pilate was known for using brute force to control crowds. He was very afraid of sedition and insurrection anytime, but especially during Passover. And the Romans weren't stupid. They knew what the holiday meant to the Jews. Okay, so is there a trial? Yes. In the Gospels, Pilate is portrayed as being as close to innocent as he possibly could be. He's portrayed as being forced by the priests and the Jewish people to execute Jesus, and he didn't really want to do it. Pilate says in the Gospels, "I find no crime in this man." And in Mark's Gospel, the Jews are shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." This is a pretty well-known picture. This is supposed to be Pilate showing the crowd Jesus after he's been whipped and had a crown of thorns on his head. All four Gospels relate a story of Barabbas. Okay, the oldest manuscripts call Barabbas, they give him a first name. They call him Jesus Barabbas. That may be significant. He's supposed to be a notorious prisoner, a murderer, maybe an insurrectionist. Now, the Gospels talk about some kind of a Passover custom where the crowd was permitted to free one prisoner in exchange for another. And if that was the case, then the crowd is calling for Barabbas's release so that he would be freed and instead Jesus would be crucified. So in the story, Pilate reluctantly gives in, frees Barabbas, and orders Jesus of Nazareth to be crucified to appease the crowd. And again, Pilate says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." In other words, Pilate's making himself, even though he's the ultimate authority, he's fobbing the blame off on the Jewish people. Now in Matthew's Gospel, it says, "Let his blood be upon us and our children." This one line is the origin of most of the anti-Semitism in Christian countries. Right here. It begins with this. And also, the whole Gospel of John is full of anti-Jewish stuff. But this one line makes it really clear who's to blame, who's the Christ killer. Okay, what's the interpretation of the Barabbas story? The whole thing is fictional. There was no custom of freeing prisoners by the Romans. They didn't do that. So what's going on? The name Barabbas seems to be a slight corruption of the Aramaic words Bar Abba, which means son of the father. And if his first name was Jesus, this likely was some kind of oblique reference to Jesus of Nazareth. That may be who they're really talking about here. But there was no such custom. So yes?
It's strange that it's so consistent. They're talking about Barabbas in all the Gospels, but still.
Once the story got as far as being written into Mark's Gospel, the other three Gospel writers had access to it. So, I mean, that's how you could get a story like this showing up in all four of them. That's the best guess. It appears as though the story was invented to deflect the blame to the Jewish people from the Romans. Okay, let's talk about crucifixion a little bit. This was a common punishment the Romans used not for thievery, not for robbery, but for sedition, for rebellions, any kind of uprising against the Roman state. It was not used for thieves or robbers. You know, the other two people who were crucified on either side of Jesus in the stories, they were not robbers. They were not thieves. They were either fellow insurrectionists or there was some other reason that the Roman government wanted to take them out for fear of some kind of seditious activity. They might have even been his disciples. We don't know, but they were not robbers or thieves. Almost always crucifixions were done of non-Roman citizens. They did not crucify Roman citizens. They were happy to crucify slaves or people in the occupied provinces like Judea if they got out of line and threatened the Roman state. And they use crucifixion for deterrence, just like people do now who favor capital punishment, even though it doesn't work. And they did it to set an example. They would set the crucifixes up in the most prominent public place so everybody would see what was going on. They'd see what would happen if you crossed the state. So what other times were Roman crucifixions used? Christians tend to get the impression that there were only 3 people the Romans ever crucified. Not so. 100 years before Jesus' death, there was a slave uprising in Rome. This starred Spartacus, you know, the guy who looked sort of like Kirk Douglas. This was 100 years before, and it was put down by the Roman army under Crassus and Pompey. The Romans crucified 6,000 rebels who had been slaves. And they set up the crosses along the Appian Way in Italy. So if you went anywhere in Italy, you wouldn't miss seeing at least one person hanging on the cross. They were they were quick to do it. Also, the next big time the Jews were crucified was a generation after Jesus' death. The first Jewish-Roman war that began in the year 66. Now, it began with tax protests, and it grew into a full-blown insurrection and civil war in Judea, and also it spread into the Galilee. During the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, before the Romans were able to breach the walls and get in, the people in the city of Jerusalem were expecting deliverance from God, and they destroyed their own food supply. And so they were starving to death. After a month or two, it was so bad that people in Jerusalem were willing to take a chance and at midnight would open the gates enough to run out and try to get past the Romans who were laying siege to the city. Well, it didn't work. The Romans would capture them as soon as they got outside the gate, and they'd crucify them on the siege works set up outside the city so that everybody that's in Jerusalem, if they got up on the walls and looked out, they'd see people being, up to 500 people a day, being crucified for 6 months until the Romans breached the walls of the city and got in and destroyed it. Okay, what about the crucifixion of Jesus? The gospel stories portray every aspect of what happened in the Passion Week as being prophecy from the Old Testament being fulfilled. This includes the betrayal, the arrest, the crucifixion. They tried to portray this as fulfilled prophecy. The reason they did that was they were trying to attract Jews to the new Christian movement. Now, as Gentiles instead came into the Christian movement, Gentiles didn't know anything about the Hebrew Bible, and they wouldn't have been impressed by this. But anyway, these are some of the items that had specific references in the Old Testament. The rejection by the Jews, the betrayal for the 30 pieces of silver, the fact that he's supposed to have been crucified with thieves, but they said they weren't thieves. His hands and feet were pierced. These things all relate to specific chapters and verses in the Hebrew Bible. He prays for his persecutors. He's given gall and vinegar. His side is pierced. Lots are cast for his garments by the Roman soldiers. Buried in a rich man's tomb. I'll get to that in a minute. Rising from the dead. This is in one of the Psalms. Ascending into heaven. Another Psalm. So in other words, his death was what the scholars call prophecy historicized. Something actually happened in history, and they tried to relate it back to Hebrew Bible prophecies. And most of those things, none of those things really were prophecies, but it didn't make any difference. I mean, if Matthew or any of the other gospel writers could say, there, it says in Psalms, even though it doesn't sound like it relates to Jesus, it relates, it really does relate to him. So they were trying to convince Jews that Jesus' death was what God ordained, because they could find passages in the Hebrew Bible that seemed to reinforce that. So anyway, the idea was that Jesus' death is being portrayed as God's plan. The idea was to impress Jews, Jesus' followers, and people that they were hoping would become Jesus' followers. Now, in reality, his followers probably didn't know anything that happened to him other than the fact that he was crucified. They knew that, but not much else. Now, there's a story in the Gospels, all four of them, of the veil in the temple being torn in half. So what does that mean? Again, this is the temple. This is the building itself. This is the Temple Mount and the outer court. This is the temple building. And deep in the building, in the room that's separated, in the room that God was supposed to live in, there was a heavily knitted or crocheted veil hanging down that separated the place where God lived from the whole rest of the world. So it covered the entrance to what the Jews called the Holy of Holies. In Luke, the veil tears during the crucifixion itself. In Matthew and Luke, it tears after the crucifixion. This is supposed to be symbolic. This was invented by the early church. The idea being that Jesus' death removed the separation that had existed between God and the people. In any kind of religion that has priests, there is almost by definition a separation between the people and the deity. That's true in the Catholic churches, it's true in any religion that I've ever heard of. The priests function as go-betweens. They're not ministers. They function as go-betweens between the deity and the people. And in Judaism, it was explicit by having this big veil, this big curtain separating God from the people. And by this supposed tearing of the veil, it means that God was no longer separated from the people. Did it happen? No. It doesn't make any difference. This is supposed to be the priests looking at the veil being torn in half. And here's the traditional 7-branched menorah next to the Holy of Holies entrance. Okay, in Matthew's gospel only, and only in Matthew's gospel, while Jesus is being crucified, the tombs are opened. It says, many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. That's not in any of the other gospels, and there's certainly no other attestation of this from any other source, but basically this is a zombie apocalypse. And scholars have been wringing their hands trying to figure out what exactly Matthew was getting at here. Yeah, it looks like the Gaza Strip, so maybe it foretold something. Okay, the death of Jesus. In the Gospels, he dies within a few hours of being on the cross. That's very unusual. People could usually survive for 3 days or so if they were in any kind of physical shape. And then they die from suffocation and dehydration. The part of the story includes the fact that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. That also is extremely unlikely. It was not common practice for the Romans to let anybody off the cross. They leave them up there after they died until the bodies rotted and the dogs and the vultures would get to them. That was the usual practice. And there's no reason to think they would have treated Jesus any different. Also, for Jews and maybe for other people at the time, not being buried was a shameful thing. You wouldn't think people would be worried about being shamed after death, but they did. So not being buried was a shameful way to spend your post-mortem time. Okay, Easter. This is when we can play music by the Rolling Stones. Sorry. Okay, so what happens on Easter Sunday? All the Gospels say that there was no body in the tomb. Well, if in fact Jesus wasn't buried, there'd be an easy explanation for that. In Matthew's Gospel, there was an angel outside the tomb. Mark's Gospel, there was one man inside the tomb. In Luke's Gospel, there were two men inside the tomb. And in John's Gospel, nobody was in the tomb. Okay, so there's a little discrepancy here among the various Gospel stories. In Mark's Gospel, the two Marys, and this is Mary Magdalene and a Mary, I think supposedly the mother of Jesus, but it's not clear about that. The two Marys run out of the tomb and tell nobody. In Matthew, Luke, and John, the two Marys run out of the tomb and they tell everybody. Well, the stories, you can't have it both ways. They either told nobody or they told everybody. What about the resurrection? Well, in Matthew's and Mark's Gospel, the original version of it, the short one, there is no resurrection. Mark's Gospel ends with the empty tomb. Why didn't Mark include a resurrection? Well, maybe he didn't know about it. Matthew's Gospel, all the disciples flee to Galilee, which would have been, 50 miles north of Jerusalem, 70 miles actually. And there they see Jesus, all the disciples. In Luke's Gospel, they don't all go to the Galilee. Two of the disciples see Jesus on the road to Emmaus, which is a little town within walking distance of Jerusalem. And then other disciples who were in Jerusalem, all the others were in Jerusalem, all see Jesus at the upper room, as it talks about in Acts. Now in John's Gospel, Jesus appears to all the disciples in a locked room somewhere in Judea. So the stories are inconsistent. So what's going on here? There was a basic tradition of an empty tomb that was common among the early Christians. There apparently was not a common resurrection tradition. And so each of the gospel writers wrote his own. So there was no common tradition for that. What's the scholarly opinion of all this? Well, one of the senior Bible scholars, John Dominic Crossan, said, with regard to the body of Jesus, by Sunday morning, those who cared where it was did not know, and those who knew did not care. So that's sort of the state of things at the time that the Gospels were written. The people who wrote about it, who really cared, didn't really know what happened other than the fact that he was crucified. All the Gospels go to some length to blame the Jewish authorities and to try to not blame Pilate. They all have the Barabbas story. Blaming the Jews for the crucifixion, there were two reasons for blaming the Jews. And this reflected what was going on in the early church toward the end of the first century when the Gospels were written. There was significant hostility among early Christians toward mainline Jews. The reason being Jews weren't converting very much. And these early Christians were still coming to the synagogue for worship, but the more they preached that Jesus was God's relative, the less they were welcomed. And in fact, the mainline Jews were kicking the Christians out of the synagogue by the end of the first century. So what were the Christians trying to do? Well, they were trying to blame the Jews partly because of the hostility, but also they didn't want to aggravate the Romans any more than was necessary. The Romans were still in power. They had destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burned the temple, and the Christians basically didn't want to honk them off if they didn't have to. By blaming the Jews, they could minimize the role that Pontius Pilate and the Roman authorities had. So now what's the real truth of Easter? What's the real truth in all of this? It's a bunny bringing decorated eggs. That's the real truth. That's the end of my talk. Yes.
Would you explain when each of the Gospels were written so people can understand how one person might copy after the other?
It's thought, again, this is not written in concrete because nobody knows for sure, and the Gospels are not dated. Mark's Gospel is the shortest. It includes no birth, no resurrection, and because of that, the scholars think it's the first one written, that the birth stories, the virgin birth, hadn't been created yet at the time that Mark wrote his Gospel, perhaps around the year 70. It's thought it's written about that he wrote his Gospel about the time that the temple was destroyed, because he has Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple. It's real easy to make a prediction if the thing actually had already happened. So it's thought that Mark wrote his gospel around the year 70, no earlier than that. Matthew and Luke copied most of the good stuff out of Mark's gospel, and then they added some of their own. They added their own birth stories, and then they added their versions of what happened on Easter and the resurrection stuff. It's thought that Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels maybe around the year 85 or so, 80 to 85. John's Gospel is a whole different kettle of fish because it seems to reflect what scholars call a high Christology, where Jesus is no longer human. Jesus is basically God appearing on the earth as a human, almost play acting as a human. The Word made flesh, that's John's Gospel. Now, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is apparently completely human. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus' father is the big guy upstairs. I mean, it's supposed to be a virgin birth. Well, if it's a virgin birth, who's the father? It's not a human, obviously. So in Matthew and Luke, Jesus is not wholly human. He's half human and half God, half divine. In John's Gospel, there's also no birth story because Jesus existed from the beginning of the universe, created by God. In the Greek language, the logos, which means the God principle. Not exactly equal to the high God, but pretty close. And so in John's Gospel, Jesus effectively is God, and whether you want to call it God's Son or whatever. Now, for Jews, that would be really hard to accept, the idea that God would have relatives. Jews were by this time, they were very monotheistic. But the pagans who converted to Christianity would have no problem accepting the fact that God could have all kinds of relatives. There's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that says that everybody goes anywhere after they die, but it was apparently a common belief at that time in the first century that everybody who died would go to one of either two, it may be the same place with two different names. The one name is Sheol, as in English spelled S-H-E-O-L, and the other place that you sometimes see in the writings from that time period is a place called Gehenna. Now for us in Ohio, that's beneficial because it's a suburb of Columbus, but for everybody else, that'd be a real problem. But anyway, that was the Jewish belief. Jews did not have a belief in heaven and hell the way Christians developed it. That came from, I don't know, the Babylonians or somebody.
That's still true?
Yes, that's still true. Jews don't believe in heaven or hell. Not officially. I mean, some Jews might, as a personal belief, but it's not in the religion. There's no idea, no concept of original sin in Judaism either. In fact, the concept of sin is different. In Judaism, the concept of sin means missing the mark, something that you can correct. That's different from what Christians believe. But of course, in Judaism, the only real reward you have is you hope that God's going to keep you alive this year. On Yom Kippur, Jews fast and they pray to God that God will keep them alive one more year because there's nothing afterwards. So that's the Jewish belief. And that was not terribly appealing to anybody other than Jews, so Jews never converted very many people. The Christians, on the other hand, went into countries where people believed in Zeus and Jupiter and all these other deities that offered people practically nothing. And they said, if you accept this belief, you're going to die, but you're not going to stay dead very long. You're going to eventually live forever as soon as Christ comes back the second time. Now, Christ came and went the first time, and apparently not much happened. And so the Christians were offering people eternal life as soon as Jesus makes the trip back. Paul believed that. And that's what he was preaching to people. And he had to modify it when it didn't happen. But the initial belief of Christians was that any time now, he's coming back. He's going to be on the clouds. It's going to be the rapture. They didn't call it that then, but That's what Christians were taught, and boy, it worked. I mean, they converted people like crazy with that belief.
When was Revelations written compared to?
The book of Revelation was thought to have been written sometime in the last quarter of the first century. My own thought was it was written about the year 79 or 80. And I think, again, you're hearing me a little bit of my interpretation. It might have been written in response to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius.
Just was thinking that.
And the reason for that is there are passages in there that if you look at them, they represent what people would have seen if they were in ships in the Bay of Naples when Vesuvius erupted. I mean, I didn't invent this idea. This came from some other people, but it makes sense. And the audience that the author of Revelation was aiming at was not us in the 21st century. He wrote this book for 7 congregations of early Jewish Christians that were living in what's now Turkey. And he names them at the beginning of the book. Now, I had read that scholars in the past thought, well, you don't have to pay much attention to those. That's not the real part of the book. He wrote these notes to these 7 congregations, but that was just added later. Well, modern scholars think, no, it wasn't added later. That was the intended audience for his book. These are people who knew the Hebrew scripture, so they were not pagan converts for the most part. They were Jews who converted to Christianity, and they were living in these 7 communities in Asia Minor, in what's now Turkey.
So who wrote the book?
Someone named John. Revelation was written by somebody named John, who lived on the Isle of Patmos. This is not the same person as the 4th gospel writer, who was not. First of all, you can tell by the different Greek use of the Greek language. The person who wrote the Gospel of John was a skilled writer in the Greek language. He was literate. He could compose well and write well in the Greek language. The person who wrote the book of Revelation wrote it as if the Greek language were a second language for him, because it's ungrammatical, and he uses Aramaic expressions that someone who is a native Greek writer wouldn't know about. And
Who decided it would be part of the Bible?
it was one of the church councils in like 396. How did any of the books get in there? There were for the New Testament at least, there were church councils that made that decision. And it was mostly at the end of the 300s. It was not the Council of Nicaea. They were worrying about heresy at the Council of Nicaea, and they didn't choose any of the biblical books at that council. But there were later ones where they decided which ones would be in and which ones wouldn't.